Welcome back to Second Chance Histories, where we explore the extraordinary moments that remind us how deeply interconnected our lives truly are, and how sometimes the most mysterious events have the most beautiful human explanations. Today's story takes us into the heart of one man's grief and the remarkable series of events that led him to discover that help can come from the most unexpected places. When 54-year-old Robert Martinez began receiving handwritten letters that seemed impossible to explain, he thought he was losing touch with reality. But what he discovered would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary mysteries have the most touching human solutions. This is the story of Letters from the Beyond, where a grieving widower's desperate loneliness led him on a journey that would save not just his own life, but the life of a stranger who was very much alive and desperately needed someone to care. Robert Martinez had been married to Elena for 28 years when cancer took her away on a cold February morning in 2019. Theirs had been the kind of marriage that friends envied, built on inside jokes, shared dreams, and a communication so natural that they often finished each other's sentences. Elena was a retired elementary school teacher who collected vintage postcards and wrote thank you notes by hand long after the rest of the world had moved to digital communication. Robert, a postal worker who had spent 30 years delivering mail throughout their neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona, found himself utterly lost without her. The house felt impossibly quiet. Meals became something he forgot to eat. The routines they had built together, morning coffee shared in silence, evening walks around the block, weekend trips to antique stores where Elena would hunt for postcards, all became painful reminders of what he had lost. Friends and family encouraged him to join support groups, to seek counseling, to consider dating again after a reasonable period of mourning. But Robert couldn't imagine connecting with anyone else. Elena hadn't just been his wife. She had been his best friend, his confidant, the person who made sense of the world for him. Without her, he felt like he was living someone else's life. By the first anniversary of Elena's death, Robert had withdrawn almost completely from social contact. He went to work, delivered mail with the same reliability he had always shown, and returned home to an empty house where he spent his evenings watching television shows that Elena had loved, hoping somehow to feel closer to her. It was during this period of profound isolation that the first letter arrived. On a Tuesday morning in March 2020, exactly 13 months after Elena's death, Robert found something in his mailbox that made his hands shake. A handwritten envelope addressed to him in what appeared to be Elena's distinctive cursive writing. The envelope was cream-colored, the kind of quality stationery Elena had always preferred for special occasions. There was no return address, just E. Martinez written in the corner. Robert's rational mind immediately began generating explanations. Someone was playing a cruel joke. He was finally having the breakdown he had been expecting, or perhaps Elena had written the letter before she died and somehow it had been delayed. But when he opened the envelope, those explanations seemed inadequate. The letter was written in Elena's unmistakable handwriting, but the content was what truly shook him. My dearest Robert, I know this must seem strange, and I can't fully explain how this reached you. I can see how much pain you're in, and it breaks my heart. You've stopped taking care of yourself, that you've stopped connecting with the people who love you. This isn't what I would want for you, mi amor. Please remember that love doesn't disappear. It finds new ways to show itself through the kindness of others. I need you to start living again, not just existing. Look for the signs that people care about you. They're everywhere if you know how to see them. All my love, Elena. Robert read the letter dozens of times that first day, analyzing every word, every pen stroke, every detail of the handwriting. It was unmistakably Elena's writing, not just similar, but identical down to the way she dotted her I's and the distinctive way she wrote the letter G. The paper even smelled faintly of the lavender soap she had always used. But what disturbed him most was how accurate the observations were. The letter referenced his current state with uncanny precision. His poor eating habits, his withdrawal from family and friends, his general neglect of self-care. How could anyone know these details about his private struggles? 3 days later, another letter arrived. The second letter was even more specific and impossible to dismiss. Robert, I saw you throw away the casserole that Mrs. Rodriguez brought over without even tasting it. I know you don't feel like eating, but you're getting too thin. Also, you missed calling your sister Carmen on her birthday yesterday. She's hurt, even though she won't say so. These small connections matter more than you know. Please don't let grief make you forget how to love the people who are still here. There are more signs of care coming your way. Check the garage. You'll find something that will remind you of happier times. Con amor, Elena. Robert rushed to the garage, his heart pounding. Hidden behind a box of Christmas decorations, he found something he had forgotten. A small wooden birdhouse that Elena had painted for him the previous spring, intended as a surprise for their anniversary. She had hidden it there and never had the chance to give it to him before her diagnosis consumed their lives. The discovery left him reeling. No one else knew about the birdhouse. Elena had painted it in secret and hidden it herself. Yet someone or something had known exactly where to direct him to find this forgotten token of love. Over the following weeks, letters arrived with startling regularity, sometimes twice a week, sometimes with gaps of 10 days. Each one contained intimate knowledge of Robert's daily life, gentle encouragement about his grief process, and small revelations about things only Elena could have known. But more than the mysterious knowledge, the letters were changing Robert in ways he couldn't ignore. He found himself eating better, calling his sister, even accepting an occasional dinner invitation from concerned neighbors. It was as if Elena's voice in the letters was slowly calling him back to life. The letters continued for 3 months, each one more detailed and personally meaningful than the last. Robert began to document everything, photographing the letters, noting the dates they arrived, recording how the advice in each letter proved to be exactly what he needed to hear. Then, in late June, a letter arrived that changed everything. My darling Robert, I need to tell you something important. These letters, they're not exactly what you think they are, but the love behind them is completely real. The care you've been feeling is genuine, but it comes from someone who needs your help just as much as you've needed these words of comfort. There's someone at apartment 3B at 1247 Maple Street who has been thinking about you every day. Someone who understands loneliness in ways that might surprise you. Go today. Trust that sometimes the most beautiful connections happen in the most unexpected ways. Elena. Robert stared at the address. 1247 Maple Street was only 6 blocks from his house, in a part of the neighborhood where he rarely had reason to go. The street name was familiar. It was part of his mail route, but he couldn't immediately picture apartment 3B. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings. This felt like the setup for something potentially dangerous, or at least deeply embarrassing. But the letters had been so accurate, so filled with genuine care and knowledge that seemed impossible for anyone else to possess, that he felt compelled to investigate. That afternoon, Robert drove to Maple Street. 1247 turned out to be a modest 3-story apartment building, the kind of place where young professionals and elderly people on fixed incomes lived quietly. The building was well maintained but unremarkable. Brown brick, small balconies, a simple entrance with mailboxes in the lobby. Apartment 3B was on the 2nd floor. Robert stood outside the door for nearly 10 minutes, trying to decide what to say. How do you explain to a stranger that you received mysterious letters directing you to their home? How do you ask someone if they know anything about impossible correspondence? Finally, he knocked. The woman who answered the door was in her early 70s, small and frail, with intelligent eyes that seemed far too large for her thin face. She wore a faded pink robe and moved slowly, as if every step required careful consideration. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Robert Martinez. And this is going to sound very strange, but I received a letter telling me to come here to apartment 3B. I think you might be able to help me understand something that's been happening to me." The woman's face went pale. Her hand gripped the doorframe for support. "Letters," she whispered. "You've been receiving letters?" "Yes, letters that seem to know things about my life that no one else could know. And the last one told me to come here." The woman's knees seemed to give out slightly. She steadied herself against the wall. "Oh my God," she said. "Oh my dear God. Please come in. My name is Dorothy Chen, and I think I need to tell you about something I've been doing." Dorothy Chen's apartment was small but filled with an extraordinary sight. Hundreds of handwritten letters scattered across every surface. The dining table, the couch, the kitchen counter, even stacked in neat piles on the floor. The apartment smelled of ink and paper, and Dorothy moved through the maze of correspondence like someone navigating a familiar library. "I started writing letters about a year ago," Dorothy began, her voice shaky with emotion. "After my husband died, after my children stopped calling regularly, after I realized I might spend my remaining years completely alone. I felt like I was disappearing, like no one would notice if I just stopped existing." She gestured to the letters surrounding them. "So I began writing to people. Strangers mostly. I would walk through the neighborhood, observing people, noticing those who seemed to be struggling or lonely. And then I would come home and write them letters of encouragement." Robert stared at her in amazement. "But Dorothy, how did you know about Elena? About our life together? About things that only she could know?" Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "I'm a retired private investigator, Robert. For 40 years, specialized in finding missing persons and gathering information about people's lives. When I saw you walking alone, looking so lost, I used my old skills to learn about you. I researched your wife's death, talked to neighbors, even looked through public records to understand your situation." She moved to a specific pile of letters and pulled out several manila folders. "Look at these files. I documented everything I learned about you and Elena. Your marriage, her illness, her personality, even small details I gathered from people who knew you both." Robert examined the files, stunned. Dorothy had compiled an incredibly detailed dossier about his life. Newspaper clippings about Elena's volunteer work, interviews with former colleagues, even photographs she had taken of Elena's gravesite to study the flowers he left there. "Dorothy, this is incredible detective work. But the handwriting in the letters I received, it was exactly Elena's handwriting, not yours." Dorothy nodded, looking almost ashamed. "I spent months practicing her handwriting. I found samples of her writing in old church newsletters, thank you notes she had written to local businesses, even her signature from voter registration records. I'm very good at forgery. It was part of my investigative work for decades." She led him to a desk covered with handwriting samples and practice sheets. "I studied Elena's handwriting until I could replicate it perfectly. I wanted the letters to feel authentic, to give you the comfort of feeling connected to her again." As Robert processed this revelation, he found himself torn between amazement at Dorothy's skill and dedication, and confusion about her motivation for such an elaborate deception. "Dorothy," he said gently, "why? Why would you go to such incredible lengths for a complete stranger? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Because, she said finally, you looked exactly like my husband did in the months before he died. Not physically, emotionally. That same lost, hollow expression. That same way of moving through the world like you were already half gone. She sat down heavily in her kitchen chair. My husband died of loneliness, Robert. Not cancer, not heart disease, loneliness. After he retired, he withdrew from everyone and everything. He stopped caring about his health, stopped maintaining friendships, stopped finding joy in anything. I watched him fade away, and I couldn't figure out how to bring him back. Robert felt a chill of recognition. That's exactly what was happening to me. I know. Could see it. I thought maybe if I could help you feel connected to Elena again, if I could give you reasons to take care of yourself and reconnect with people who cared about you, maybe I could save you in a way I couldn't save my husband. Dorothy stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the street below. But there's something else, Robert. Something I haven't told you yet. She turned back to him, her expression grave. I wasn't just trying to save you. I was trying to save myself. I've been planning to end my own life. Tonight, actually. I had everything prepared. But writing those letters to you, focusing on someone else's grief and recovery, gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my husband died. The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. Dorothy, no. You can't. The last letter I sent you, the one that brought you here, that was supposed to be my final act. He wanted to make sure you understood that someone had been caring about you, thinking about you every day before I gave up. Robert stared at her in horror and amazement. Dorothy, you've been saving my life for months. You can't end yours now. What followed was the most important conversation of both their lives. Robert realized that Dorothy had been living in the same isolation and despair that had been consuming him. Her elaborate project of writing letters to him had been as much about her own survival as his. Dorothy, you have an incredible gift, Robert said. What you've done for me, the research, the care, the attention to exactly what I needed to hear, that's not just detective work. That's a form of healing that I've never experienced, not even in professional counseling. Dorothy looked skeptical. It was manipulation, Robert. Forgery. Deception. No, Robert said firmly. It was love in action. It was someone caring so deeply about a stranger's well-being that they devoted months of their life to helping that person heal. The method might have been unconventional, but the result was genuine healing. Over the following hours, Robert and Dorothy shared their stories of loss, loneliness, and the gradual withdrawal from life that had been consuming them both. They discovered remarkable parallels in their experiences and an immediate understanding of each other's pain. Dorothy, I have a proposition, Robert said as the evening grew late. Instead of either of us giving up on life, what if we became a team? What if we used your incredible skills to help other people who are struggling with grief and isolation? Dorothy looked intrigued but cautious. What do you mean? I deliver mail to hundreds of people every day. I see the signs of loneliness and depression constantly. People who stop collecting their mail, houses that look abandoned even though someone lives there, elderly people who seem to have no visitors. What if we could identify these people and find ways to help them? The idea energized Dorothy in a way Robert hadn't seen all day. We could develop a systematic approach to identifying and supporting isolated community members. My investigative skills, your daily access to neighborhoods, both of our understanding of what it feels like to be forgotten. That night, instead of ending her life, Dorothy began planning a new one. She and Robert developed what they called the Neighborhood Care Project, a systematic approach to identifying and supporting isolated community members throughout Phoenix. Robert used his mail route to identify people who seemed to be struggling with loneliness or depression. Dorothy would then use her investigative skills to learn about their situations and develop personalized approaches to offering support and connection. But they abandoned the deception that had characterized Dorothy's letters to Robert. Instead, they began making direct contact with people, offering practical help, companionship, and connections to community resources. Within 6 months, they had helped dozens of isolated individuals reconnect with family members, access mental health services, find volunteer opportunities, and build social connections. Dorothy's apartment became an informal community center where lonely people could come for conversation, letter writing assistance, and emotional support. "What Dorothy did for me was miraculous," Robert explained to a local newspaper reporter who wrote about their project. "Not because it was supernatural, but because it was so thoroughly human. She saw someone in pain and devoted herself completely to helping them heal. That kind-of focused, intentional care is rarer and more powerful than any mystery." Word of Robert and Dorothy's work spread throughout their community and beyond. Social workers began referring clients to their informal support network. Churches and community organizations asked them to speak about their approach to identifying and helping isolated individuals. Dorothy discovered that her skills as an investigator translated perfectly into social work. She could quickly assess someone's situation, identify their specific needs, and develop practical strategies for improving their circumstances. Robert found that his daily interactions with people on his mail route became opportunities for connection and care rather than just professional obligation. He developed an informal network of community members who helped watch out for neighbors in need. "We realized that loneliness is an epidemic in our society," Dorothy explained during one of their community presentations. "But it's not an incurable disease. It just requires people who are willing to pay attention and take action." 3 years after they met, Robert and Dorothy established a formal non-profit organization dedicated to combating social isolation in elderly and grieving populations. They developed training programs for postal workers, utility workers, and other professionals who have regular access to residential areas, teaching them to recognize signs of isolation and depression. Their work eventually came to the attention of Dr. Patricia Williamson, a researcher at Arizona State University who was studying innovative approaches to combating social isolation and depression in elderly populations. Dr. Williamson documented the outcomes of Robert and Dorothy's interventions, finding remarkable success rates in helping isolated individuals reconnect with community resources and improve their mental health outcomes. "What Robert and Dorothy discovered," Dr. Williamson explained in her published research, "is that effective intervention for loneliness and depression doesn't require professional training. It requires genuine care, practical skills, and sustained commitment." Their approach represents a model that could be replicated in communities nationwide. The study revealed that people helped by Robert and Dorothy showed significant improvements in depression scores, social connection measures, and overall life satisfaction compared to control groups receiving conventional services. But perhaps most remarkably, Dr. Williamson's research documented something unexpected. Robert and Dorothy themselves showed the greatest improvements of all the study participants. By focusing their energy on helping others heal from loneliness and depression, they had achieved their own recovery from these conditions. Robert Martinez, once a man so consumed by grief that he had withdrawn from all social connection, became a nationally recognized advocate for community-based approaches to combating social isolation. He retired early from the Postal Service to work full-time on expanding their model to other communities. Elena's death nearly destroyed me, Robert reflected during one interview. But somehow it led me to discover my life's purpose. I don't think Elena is sending me messages from beyond, but I do think the love we shared continues to inspire me to love other people in ways I never did before. Dorothy, meanwhile, transformed from a woman planning suicide into someone who received requests for consultation from social service agencies across the country. She developed training materials for volunteer programs focused on supporting isolated, elderly individuals. But perhaps most importantly, Dorothy's own loneliness became a thing of the past. Her apartment, once filled with letters she wrote to strangers, became filled with visitors, people she was helping, volunteers she was training, and friends she had made through their community work. "I thought I was going to die alone and forgotten," Dorothy said during her speech at a national conference on aging. "Instead, I found out that the antidote to loneliness isn't being cared for. It's caring for others. When you focus on alleviating someone else's isolation, your own isolation disappears." 8 years after Robert received his first mysterious letter, the Neighborhood Care Project operates in 47 communities across 12 states. Thousands of volunteers have been trained in their approach to identifying and supporting isolated community members. The program has evolved to include technology components, apps that help volunteers document and coordinate their outreach efforts, online training modules, and social media groups where participating communities can share strategies and success stories. But the core of their approach remains unchanged: genuine human connection, practical support, and the understanding that everyone has the capacity to help alleviate someone else's loneliness. Dorothy continues to write letters, but now they're signed with her own name and sent with full transparency about who she is and why she's reaching out. Her direct, honest approach to connecting with isolated individuals has proven just as effective as her earlier mysterious communications with Robert. The mystery wasn't important, Dorothy reflects. What was important was that someone was paying attention, someone cared, and someone was willing to take action. Those things don't require supernatural intervention. They just require people who are willing to notice each other's pain and do something about it. Today, Robert Martinez and Dorothy Chan are both in their 60s, both healthy and active, and both surrounded by a community of people whose lives they've touched. They remain close friends and working partners, bound together by the experience that saved both their lives. Robert never received another mysterious letter, but he no longer needs them. Through his work with Dorothy, he found a way to honor Elena's memory that brings him joy and purpose rather than pain. "Elena's last gift to me wasn't supernatural communication," Robert says. "It was the loneliness that drove me to desperation, because that desperation made me open to the help that Dorothy was offering." Sometimes our lowest moments are what make us ready to accept the love that's been there all along. Dorothy's story has become a model for how retired professionals can use their skills to address social problems in their communities. Her transition from private investigator to community healer demonstrates that the same skills used to gather information about people can be used to provide them with exactly the kind of support they need. The letters from the beyond weren't supernatural. They were the result of one lonely person's extraordinary dedication to healing another lonely person's pain. But that doesn't make them less miraculous. It makes them more so, because it proves that ordinary humans have the capacity to create extraordinary healing when they truly commit to caring for each other. In a world that often feels disconnected and isolated, Robert and Dorothy's story proves that the most powerful antidote to loneliness isn't mysterious or complicated. It's simply the willingness of one person to notice another person's pain and dedicate themselves to alleviating it. The miracle wasn't the letters themselves. The miracle was the love, care, and human connection that inspired them, and the transformed lives that resulted from two people deciding that neither of them had to face their pain alone.